Good day, LU5 students. I am Dr. Cecil Jimeno, and we are here to talk about some of the legislation that are important for you as future prescribers. Today, we will focus on the Generics Act of 1988 and partly also the Philippine National Formulary. The Generics Act of 1998 is Republic Act 6675, which is an act to promote, require, and ensure the production of an adequate supply, distribution, use, and acceptance of medicines identified by their generic names. This means, therefore, that this act or this law does not just cover our prescriptions, but in fact, it covers the much broader issue of having drugs become available and accessible to the greater number of persons in the country. Next, we'll talk about what is a generic drug, a brief review from Therapeutics 201. As defined by the US FDA, a generic drug is a drug product that is comparable to a brand or the reference listed drug product, similar in or comparable in dosage form, strength, route of administration, quality and performance characteristics, and intended use. Generic drugs can be marketed after patent and exclusivity protection ends, or once the patent owner waives their rights and the FDA requirements are met. Why do we want generic drugs? Ultimately, the use of generic drugs should result in reduced drug costs, increased access to drugs, and the prevention of drug dosages. But we need to ensure, therefore, that these generic drugs are of the same quality as the original brand. And there are measures to do that, no? And one way to demonstrate that the characteristics of the generic drug is the same as the originator or the original brand is actually to do bioequivalence studies. Now, how are drugs labeled? Again, a review from Therapeutics 201. A generic name is the international non-proprietary name or the INN of a drug, which is commonly used in scientific literature and by which physicians and pharmacists learn about a particular drug product in professional schools. This can be the scientific name of the active ingredients of drugs or the chemical component responsible for the therapeutic effect of the prescribed medicine. So, for example, acetyl salicylic acid, that's aspirin. No? While on the other hand, the brand name is the proprietary or trademark given by companies to distinguish their product from those of their competitors, which may be identical insofar as the active ingredients are concerned. Now, under our generics law, medical practitioners and manufacturers are required to use generic terminology in all aspects, no? That is in the importation, manufacturing, distribution, marketing, advertising and promotion, prescription, and dispensing of drugs. If you take a look at the example of metformin, metformin is the INN. We do not use the chemical name dimethylbiguanide as the INN because it's a little bit difficult to remember. So the INN or the generic name is metformin. And there are at least 25 brand names that are registered in the Philippines as metformin. And if you look across the names, no, some of them, by just reading the brand name, you wouldn't know actually that it's metformin. Let's say IMAX or Neoform or Gludin or even the originator brand Glucophage, you wouldn't know from the brand name that it's actually metformin. Okay, what is RA 6675 or the Generics Act of 1988? So again, this act seeks to promote, require, and ensure the production of an adequate supply, distribution, use, and acceptance of drugs and medicines identified by the generics name. It was developed to ensure sufficient supply of medicines in the country at the lowest possible cost. And the background of this Generics Act was right after the EDSA revolution, when we had the people power revolution, we just deposed what was someone who was seen as a dictator. And so Corazon Aquino, became the president of the country. And as part of her commitment to ensuring that she's able to address the problems of the greater majority of the Filipinos, she went on sorties, or she went throughout the country to have consultations. And in those provincial visits, she was confronted with the problem of lack of access to drugs and medicine. It was not within the reach of those belonging to the poorer sector of the Philippine society. So she felt, or government felt, that there was a need to address this issue head on, because leaving it to market forces to correct the situation was no longer a viable solution. It was felt that government had to step in and do something drastic, if any change was to be achieved, in order to then deliver on the mandate of the new 1987 Constitution, that the state shall protect and promote the right to health of the people and instill health consciousness among them. And so a task force on pharmaceuticals was created to try to draft the national drug policy of the Philippines. And this task force subsequently did literature review. They consulted a lot of people, did interviews and consultations with experts and stakeholders before they even drafted the national drug policy. So this is the whole host of people they consulted, from representatives of consumer groups, businessmen, the Manufacturers Drug Association of the Philippines, some of the universities, including UP and Ateneo, and of course the pharmacists groups. And after doing all of those consultation and literature review, the task force identified 7 major areas of concern that should be covered by the national drug policy. And this involves thinking about already developing an essential drug list, or an EDL, or a national formulary, the use of generic names, advertising and promotion should also be regulated, procurement and self-sufficiency of drugs, answering the issue of many people self-medicating, strengthening the basis for registration of pharmaceuticals, and even regulating drug pricing. So the NDP found 3 or 4 major issues that they needed to address. So the first is the lack of access of a majority of Filipinos to drugs. And the reasons for these include the fact that, number one, 70% of the population are really poor, below the poverty line, coupled with high drug prices and lack of any drug outlets in many parts of the rural areas, making drugs physically inaccessible to many Filipinos. And some essential drugs are not commercially available. In answer to number 3, actually, this is why we now have the mga butika sa barangay, to ensure that there is access to medicines. The second major issue is the continued presence in the market of fake, adulterated, misbranded, and banned drugs, poor quality drugs, due to the inconsistent and ineffective implementation of the regulations on safety, quality, and efficacy by the Bureau of Food and Drug, or the BFAD, which is the forerunner of the current Philippine FDA. So their idea was the BFAD needs to be stronger, in the way that it is implementing its regulations, so as to avoid all of these fake or misbranded or even banned drugs. The third major issue is the irrational use of drugs. This is caused by the proliferation of branded drugs that can be confusing among physicians and consumers, the prescribing habits of physicians, which is characterized by preference for certain brand names and sometimes by overpricing, self-medication also by an inadequately informed public, and selling of ethical drugs over the counter even without prescriptions, coupled with the presence in the market of irrational, ineffective, and spurious drugs. So again, it is felt that these problems can be addressed by the use of generic names. No? The irrational drug use can be prevented by using generic names and by a more efficient and effective implementation of the BFAD rules and regulations. So that in April 30, 1987, during the inauguration of the new BFAD, no? So this was the commitment to make the BFAD stronger, President Aquino also announced the national drug policy and the government's commitment to its implementation. So in fact, when it was first released, no, the national drug policy is a little bit different from what I'm presenting now. But what I'm going to present, the 5 pillars, is already after it had been tweaked subsequently. So these are the 5 pillars of the national drug policy. And the first pillar is quality control, no? Assurance of the safety, efficacy, and usefulness of pharmaceutical products through quality control. And this will involve the regulation of the importation, manufacture, marketing, and consumer utilization of all drugs and their intermediates. The second pillar rests on the promotion of rational drug use, no, or rational use of drugs by both doctors and the general public, no. And so rational use of drugs refer to a carefully considered pattern of behavior on the part of the prescriber and the consumer. So you don't prescribe drugs just because you're used to prescribing a certain brand, no? Rather, it should be a carefully considered prescription that limits the use of medications where there is a clear, valid indication for them, using only the most necessary and scientifically proven efficacious drugs for these indications. Now, what is recognized is that key for rational drug use is the development and implementation of a Philippine National Drug Formulary. Since then, that's been shortened to Philippine National Formulary to avoid the redundancy. And this PNDF or PNF will list those drugs which are most essential for the diseases and conditions that are encountered in the Philippines and describe the appropriate use of these essential drugs. Aside from this, the rules and regulations governing the promotion and advertising of pharmaceutical products shall be reviewed and amended in order to contribute towards the promotion of rational drug use. And with these 2 initiatives, the PNF and the regulation of promotion and advertising, it was thought that the consumers will now be properly guided as to which drugs to use for their particular needs and conditions. The next pillar is self-reliance, no, in the local pharmaceutical industry. This seeks to strengthen the Filipino capabilities for the manufacture of basic and intermediate ingredients for drugs and medicines. By developing a capability to produce strategic essential drugs locally, the country's dependence on imported drugs can be greatly reduced, and this will enable local drug manufacturers to be competitive with the transnational drug firms. However, this is actually not something that has been very strong, no, even after the Generics Act of 1988. But we are thankful for this pillar of the national formulary because this is where the NIRPROMP was born, no? The National Integrated Research Program on Medicinal Plants under the leadership of Dr. Nelia Maramba, which has actually helped to develop and forward the science, no, on the use of herbal and medicinal plants that are available in the country. The fourth pillar of the Philippine National Drug Policy is tailored or targeted procurement of drugs by government with the objective of making available to its own clientele, particularly the lower income sectors of the society. So government will buy the drugs, no, at negotiated prices, get the best drugs at the lowest possible cost to make it available to the greater majority of people, especially the lower income sectors of the society. It is widely acknowledged that the government is the single largest purchaser of drugs in the country, allocating a major part of its health budget for drugs and medicines. Finally, people empowerment is the fifth pillar of the Philippine National Drug Policy. And this cuts across all the four pillars and aims to assist people in exercising an informed choice in the purchase of cost-effective medicines. And this will become very clear to you later on once you realize what the Generics Act is all about. So, the formulators of the National Drug Policy realized that to effect the needed reform in the pharmaceutical system, there needed to be a law to speed up the transformation envisioned by the National Drug Policy. And so, the Senate version of the bill on the Generics Act of 1988 was sponsored by Senator Orlando Mercado, while the version in the House of Representatives was authored by Congressman Narciso Montfort. So, much like what's happening now, whenever a law is to be passed, there will be discussions, there will be interpellations, there will be several sessions of Congress and Senate to be able to take up the issues related to the law. And so, the DOH was very vigilant at every step of the legislative process, and they were very concerned to ensure that the law as written is not watered down. However, despite this kind of monitoring, an amendment was sought to be introduced by some quarters, allowing the prescriber to write no substitution. So there was an insertion of this word or similar words, which would in fact invalidate or nullify the object of the law, which is to allow the participation of the patient in the final selection of the product to buy. So if the doctor writes no substitution, then that means that the patient who's going to buy the medicines will not be able to choose what kind or which brand, which particular brand he's going to get. So alert DOH officials saw through this scheme, and members of the Joint Conference Committee, which drafted the harmonized versions of the two bodies, deleted the so-called killer amendment. So again, there were several people who were, of course, for the law and several who were against the generics law. But who do you think had the most resistance to it? Is it the Department of Health, the BFAD? Is it the pharmacists? Is it the drug manufacturers? Is it the doctors? So let's see. So the Generics Act of 1988 was signed into law by President Corazon Aquino on September 13, 1988. And during this occasion, she rallied support from all sectors for the full implementation of the law in a speech that she delivered. And then for the law to be implemented, it needed to be translated to administrative orders and several other pieces of legislation that will allow then all branches of government and for the stakeholders to be able to implement it. And so there were several DOH issuances. People needed to be educated. There were several seminar workshops that were conducted by the National Drug Policy Management Committee and the Department of Health at all of its different levels. The Commission on Audit had a circular that says that procurement of drugs should comply with the provisions of the Generics Act. Otherwise, if you don't follow it, then it will not your submission will not be passed. It will not pass post audit if you don't procure according to the Generics Act. The DOH also recognized that in order for doctors and dispensing pharmacists to comply with the requirements of the law, availability of pharmaceutical products bearing the generic names prominently had to be ensured. And so there were guidelines on generic labeling that were formulated in consultation with manufacturers, traders who own the products, and other interested parties. So that's why the full implementation of the law was delayed. There's also implementing guidelines on advertising and also for the private professional sector, meaning the groups of doctors. So in fact, among the doctors, those who had most resistance to the Generics Act were actually those in the private sector, particularly because of the provision that does not allow the provisions on the generic dispensing on substitution, meaning even if they write the brand name, the patient is actually allowed to choose whichever brand he wants. And they also protested against the penalty clauses among doctors who do not comply with the requirements as laid down by law. Because under the implementing guidelines, the patient will now have the option to choose among generically equivalent products prescribed by the doctor. So naturally, it didn't really sit well with the doctors. Now, the law was to be implemented in phases: first, education and dissemination, then voluntary compliance with monitoring but no penalties, and then afterwards, already full implementation with penalties, beginning January 1, 1990. Again, these guidelines for generic prescribing and dispensing was finalized only after a nationwide consultation was undertaken with doctors and drugstore owners from all 13 regions of the country. Do you think then that it was implemented already? No, because the officers of the Philippine Medical Association, which is the national organization of medical doctors in the Philippines, questioned the constitutionality of the law and the guidelines before the Supreme Court and filed suit. So these were some of the issues raised by the contending sides. Those who crafted the policy, the pro side, said that this generics law or act needed to be implemented to provide a wider choice of equivalent drugs with different pricing that will lower the cost of drug therapy because generic products are significantly cheaper than branded products. The patient also becomes an active participant in the therapeutic process and is now given a choice to buy effective medicine at a price he can afford even if he is poor. So to substantiate the claim that in fact generic drugs are cheaper, they even presented a cost-benefit analysis to say that generic ampicillin is so much cheaper than branded ampicillin. The formulators of the Generics Act also said that this will promote rational drug use. The use of generic names will help avoid drug duplication, especially when the patient is under the care of several physicians, preventing overdosage or toxicity. So can you imagine if you are being seen by 5 doctors and each one will prescribe, let's say, metformin, like I showed you, and the names are all different and it's hard to recognize whether that's really metformin. So that can lead to overdosage or toxicity because in fact they're prescribing duplicates without realizing it because the generic name is not written. Also, this would avoid drug interactions which can be serious or life-threatening. It can minimize medication errors and abolish irrational fixed dose combination. The use of the generic name or the INN is also facilitative of better communication as the INN is universally understood. And the generic drug name usually contains an informative stem that reflects the pharmacologic class to which the drug belongs. So it's easy for novice prescribers to recognize the drug when they see the generic name. So let's say if you see metoprolol or propranolol, so the fact that it's OLOL, you recognize that this has to do with beta blockers. The preference for brand names also leads to a lot of expense in marketing as each company would want to develop its own patented product. And so we realize that even in countries where most of the world's research and development is done, a lot of the expense or expenditure actually goes to marketing, and that's far higher than research and development. And these high prices of branded drugs encourages small and dishonest imitation, giving rise to manufacture of spurious drugs. So those are pros. Now, the cons, they had a long list of issues against the Generics Act. No, they said, and they published this in Bulletin Today for the public to read. No, they said that it poses a danger to public health because generic drugs are substandard. So that's what they're saying. They have not undergone clinical trials as to their efficacy on a regular basis, unlike brand name products, which are proven effective based on the doctor's experience in past prescriptions. No, so this is not entirely true because there is also regulation as to how a generic drug is going to be registered. Next, the mandatory use of generic drugs may be considered an infringement on the doctor's right and responsibility to choose the medicine to prescribe to patients. No? And third, the prescription system is cumbersome and dangerous and may lead to unnecessary loss of life. So they're saying that it rather than facilitating prescriptions, it might actually confuse doctors, no? And so they will make mistakes, and this will lead to unnecessary loss of lives. And the prescription form that is encouraged by the Generics Act is also tedious and will take a lot of time. Next, they said that the more than 9,000 drugstores all over the country don't have the competent personnel to handle generic prescriptions, and this again can lead to errors. And for this reason, the generic prescribing should only be for simple ailments such as headache, rather than for serious illnesses, as the clerk might make a mistake and prescribe poison instead of medicine. They also said that if drug prices are a problem, maybe the government should just lower down the taxes on pharmaceuticals rather than forcing doctors to prescribe generics, no? Because a doctor does not withhold treatment just because the patient is too poor to pay. So they're saying it's not the fault of the doctor that I prescribe this, no? Because doctors are willing to forego even their professional fee. But on the other hand, if the government really wants to help, just bring down the taxes, cut the taxes. Next, it also said that the government is not fully equipped to test all newly produced generic products, generic drugs that have flooded the market. Well, this is partly true even now, no, because the government, the FDA, doesn't actually do its own bioequivalent studies, no, rather third-party institutions like universities, no, with colleges of medicine under their departments of pharmacology or pharmacy are actually the ones who are doing the bioequivalence studies. The drug manufacturers also had their thing to say, their negative, their criticism, no, against the generics law. They said that brand names improve quality, while generic drugs would be inferior since the manufacturer is not committed or less committed to the quality of their products. And when we use generics, there will be shortages of many essential drugs because the manufacturers are rendered uneconomical, and this may in turn lead to the manufacture of spurious drugs. Next, any alleged savings will be more than doubled by the expenses incurred. So imagine that you have to relabel the drugs. That's what they're saying. There will be great cost in advertising and promoting the generic product. And so whatever cost savings will be gone, no, because of the other expenses. Fourth, the exclusive use of generic products will result in the immediate disappearance from the market of those products protected by lawful patent. So this is not true. Just because you have more generic products, you will not have the patented products. And in fact, you are not allowed to develop generic products if the patent for the original product is still in effect. Next, it amplifies the consumer's search for specific products, meaning you're making it harder for the consumer because they have to search for the specific product that they should get rather than just depending on their doctor, no? And if you use brand names, it provides efficiency for product recalls. Kunyari, I already know what I want, no? I don't want this because it had an undesirable reaction. So I want you to give me this product where I have confidence at, no? Next is that it facilitates continuity of purchases if a given brand is satisfactory. If I bought this drug last time, it's this brand, I want this brand again, no? Or conversely, it goes against further purchases if the product is not satisfactory, rather than a choice every time. Next is that it provides the basis from past reputation for evaluating new products of the manufacturer, giving incentives for the drug company to produce new products, and encouraging it to supply pertinent medical information on the product and related subjects. So parang what they're saying is that if you have a brand, you want to support that brand with the necessary medical information. And if it's a generic brand, there will probably not be that commitment. So what do you think happened with this suit, no, in the Supreme Court? What was the Supreme Court verdict? Well, of course, the Supreme Court, no, said that unanimously they uphold the validity and constitutionality of the Generics Act and the implementing AO number 62. Their decision was given 4 days before Christmas 1989, and the justices said that they cannot heed the petitioners, the doctors, plea to kill the act aborning, meaning it hasn't been tried yet. Let's give it a try, no, and allow it to prove its value to our people as envisioned by the makers. So what the Supreme Court said is that the requirement of writing the generic terminology with the brand name applies to all physicians, whether government or private physicians. It applies to all. The allegation also that the sales girl at the counter is going to substitute the prescribed medicine with another medicine belonging to the same generic group is a distortion of the clear provisions of the law, because it's not the sales girl who will make that decision. The pharmacist will present, no, the generics menu, and it will be the patient who will decide what he wants, no, in terms of the brand under the generic group. Now, what will the pharmacist or the sales girl do if there are violative prescriptions or there are erroneous prescriptions? No, there's also specific measures in the Generics Act as to what to do with it. No, so that's very clear. And in the example prescriptions, you will take a look at these. No, what are considered to be violative, what are considered to be erroneous or even impossible prescriptions. The sales girl at the counter does not decide. No? She merely informs the customer, and the customer takes a look at the list of generic drugs, what we call the generics menu, which is required by law to be posted conspicuously in the premises for the information and choice of the customer alone. And the purpose of the Generics Act is really to carry out the mandate of the state, which is to effect and promote the right to health of the people and to make essential goods, health, and other social services available to all people at affordable cost. Number 4, the prohibition against the use by doctors of no substitution and other words of similar import is a valid regulation to prevent the circumvention of the law. Meaning, the Supreme Court said the doctors can't write no substitution because it circumvents the law. The law says that the patient can choose whatever brand he wants, no, from the generics menu. So if you write no substitution, you circumvent the law. The petitioner's allegations also that the penalties imposed are excessive, it's violative of the Constitution, was also said to be having no merit because penal sanctions are indispensable if the law is to be obeyed. So it's saying, no, we have to put some sanctions, otherwise doctors will not follow. So there has to be reprimand, fines, and if this is a recurring problem, then maybe even suspension of the physician's license to practice. Now, among the many slides that I've talked about, and this is also in your in the introductory module, no, your learning guide that has been given to you, this is the most important slide. The implications of the Generics Act on the prescribing physician is that There has to be a prominent writing of the generic name of the drug. The brand name may be written but is actually not required and needs to be put in parentheses below the generic name. It also disallows the writing of "do not substitute" in the prescription, and all doctors are encouraged to educate patients about generic drugs and their rights as patients. After the prescription is presented, they are then required by law to inform the patient. The pharmacists are required by law to inform the patient that they have a right to choose the specific medicines that they will buy. And the pharmacies have to develop and provide generic drug menu cards which will be displayed in the pharmacy. And pharmacists should be trained because they're required to explain that patients can choose specific brands that may not be the same as what their doctor prescribed, and that the choices are made through the generics menu card. So Section 6 of the Generics Act, this is one of the most important sections. It's contentious, but it is important. Who shall use the generic terminology? It says all government health agencies and their personnel, as well as other government agencies. So let's say Philippine General Hospital, it's a government agency. But PAGCOR or the Supreme Court has a clinic, they're required to use generic terminology in all transactions related to purchasing, prescribing, dispensing, and administering of drugs and medicines. Now, all private practitioners, whether medical doctors, dentists, and veterinary practitioners, whether they're in private or government institutions, they shall write prescriptions using the generic name. The brand name may be included if so desired. Any organization or company involved in the manufacture, importation, repacking, marketing, or distribution of medicines shall indicate prominently the generic name of the drug. So let's say, for example, you're going to import a drug because you're going to use it to fight COVID. You're only allowed to import if the request is made using a generic name. And drug outlets, including drugstores, hospital and non-hospital pharmacies, non-traditional outlets such as supermarkets and stores where in fact they're over-the-counter drugs, shall inform also any buyer about any and all other drug products having the same generic name, together with the corresponding prices, so that the buyer may adequately exercise his option. Now, 20 years after the Generics Act was implemented in 2008, the government felt that there was a need again to intervene, and so they amended the Generics Act by prescribing more severe penalties to those who fail to comply with that so-called Section 6 of the law. In 2008, the RA 9502, called the Universally Accessible and Quality Medicines Act 2008, also mandated that they shall cap the prices of certain drugs, and I'll go to that in a while. Since then also, BFAD has been renamed as the Philippine FDA and had been strengthened, and even the pharmacy law had been passed in order to expand also the education and practice of pharmacists to be able to helpfully implement not only the generics law but many other provisions that have to do with drugs. Now, there's another slide set on the sample prescriptions regarding the implementation or the application of the generics law. So please just view that. It's a less than 10-minute slide set. But going back to the Cheaper Medicines Act of 2008, 20 years after the Generics Act of 1998, the Philippines implemented this act to improve again access to quality of drugs. So it was felt that at that time that the cost of drugs was still much too high, and so government stepped in and mandated that certain drugs will be put under a maximum retail price. And they sought to influence pharmaceutical companies to reduce their prices after being placed in a government-mediated access program. And so this is the so-called GMAP. So guess who the president was at that time? And so the general provisions of this maximum retail price is that the President of the Philippines has the power to impose this maximum retail price, and that the duration of the imposition of the MRP shall be within such a period as the situation may warrant, as determined by the President of the Philippines. No? And so after its enactment, 5 drug molecules, no, were put under a maximum retail price. It was capped. And a number of drug companies also reacted by volunteering to reduce their prices by half. No? And this voluntarily reduced drug prices were collectively referred to as drugs under the government-mediated access pricing. So these are the 5 drugs under the MDRP or under the MRP. Amlodipine, an antihypertensive, a statin, azithromycin, an antibiotic, and chemotherapy agents. And the 15 drugs are also antihypertensives, no, some antibiotics, and some chemotherapy agents. Now, aside from just putting a cap on the price of medicines, the government, especially in the formulary, has a so-called reference pricing. No? And this is seen as a very effective way to reduce the prices of certain targeted drugs. How does this work? The government puts out a list of the reference prices of all the medications in government institutions under a particular reference price. No? So if a pharmaceutical company will bid so that it can then bring in its products into the hospital for the hospital pharmacy to sell its products, they will have to bid or give a price bid that is within the reference price. It cannot bid higher than the reference price. No? And that has helped to really bring down the cost of medicines, especially in the government hospitals and facilities. Now, that was 2008 when we had the Cheaper Medicines Act. And last year, 2019, and early this year, this was again invoked by the current president, where a cap was placed on the prices of an additional 133 drugs. What is surprising, though, is that these 133 drugs are not even the drugs. Many of them are not even listed in the formulary, so they're not considered to be essential drugs. And yet, the government felt that it needed to step in order to decrease the prices of these 133 drugs. So I provided the reference for the list if you want to skim through it, just for you to find out the provisions of this EO 104 and try to check out which products are included or which drugs are included in this list. And so it's just really, in a sense, not really surprising, but challenging that 32 years after the Generics Act was first implemented, the government is still intervening to halt the high cost of medications. Because this is really true. We do have prices that are so much higher than even our Asian neighbors. I think that's my last slide for the lecture. I just want to post this last slide to talk about your assignment for this particular topic. I would like for you to think about the implications of the generics law on biologics. Biologics are typically drugs that are manufactured using recombinant DNA technology and are synthetic or pharmaceutical copies of some of our endogenous, shall we say, chemicals, let's say hormones, for example. And so the question is, do you think that the generics law should apply for biosimilars? So let's say insulin. I prescribe a specific insulin, and I wrote the brand name for that particular insulin. Of course, I will not write down do not substitute. But do you think that after the patient goes to the pharmacy, that he should be allowed to substitute another product for the one that I prescribe, for example, for insulin. What do you think, no? Should the generics law be applied for biosimilars? Why or why not? So I'd like you to think about it and submit a one paragraph summary of your opinion. I don't want anything that's very long, maybe just 3 or 4 sentences, one short paragraph to summarize your opinion on the matter. So with that, thank you very much for listening.